Have you ever heard of a ship found adrift at sea, completely abandoned with no sign of struggle, no bodies, and no explanation? A vessel sailing perfectly on course, its cargo intact, yet every soul on board simply gone? The Mary Celeste is one of maritime history's most haunting mysteries. In December 1872, this merchant brigantine was discovered floating in the Atlantic Ocean, east of the Azores. The ship was seaworthy, the cargo was untouched, but the crew, all 10 of them, along with the captain's wife and young daughter, had vanished without a trace. For over a century and a half, investigators, historians, and mystery enthusiasts have tried to solve what happened aboard the Mary Celeste. Yet despite countless theories, the truth remains elusive. Welcome to Weird World Files, where history meets the unexplained. If mysteries like this are your thing, please like the video and subscribe for more. Also, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is. And, as always with our videos, the visuals are purely to add context. You can also enjoy the full story just by listening. Ready? Let's dive in. The Mary Celeste wasn't always known by that name. She was originally christened the Amazon when she was built in 1861 on Spencer's Island in Nova Scotia, Canada. From the very beginning, her history was marked by misfortune. Her first captain, Robert McClellan, died before her maiden voyage was complete. He fell ill with pneumonia just days after taking command and passed away while the ship was still docked. The Amazon's troubles continued. On her first actual voyage under a new captain, she collided with fishing equipment near the coast of Maine. On her second journey across the Atlantic, she ran aground on Cape Breton Island. The damage was severe enough that she needed extensive repairs. Shortly after, while crossing the English Channel, she struck another vessel in thick fog. The other ship sank. The Amazon survived, but her reputation was already tarnished. In 1867, disaster struck again. While docked in New York Harbor, a fire broke out on board. The flames were eventually contained, but the damage was significant. The ship's owner at the time went bankrupt trying to keep her afloat. The Amazon was sold at auction, changing hands multiple times over the next year. By 1868, she had been salvaged, refitted, and renamed. She became the Mary Celeste. The new owners hoped a fresh start would break the pattern of bad luck. For a few years, it seemed to work. Under new ownership and new captains, she completed several successful voyages. She wasn't a glamorous ship, but she was sturdy, reliable, and profitable. In the autumn of 1872, the Mary Celeste was purchased by a consortium that included a man named James Winchester. He needed a captain for an upcoming transatlantic voyage, and he knew exactly who to ask. Captain Benjamin Briggs was 37 years old, an experienced sailor from a seafaring family in Marion, Massachusetts. His father had been a captain. His brothers were captains. Benjamin himself had been navigating the Atlantic for years and had earned a reputation as one of the most competent and trustworthy mariners on the East Coast. Briggs was also deeply religious. He didn't drink, he didn't curse. He attended church regularly and often held prayer meetings aboard his ships. Those who knew him described him as calm, methodical, and fair. He treated his crew with respect and expected the same in return. There had never been a mutiny under his command. There had never been a serious accident. He was, by all accounts, the kind of captain you wanted at the helm. For this voyage, Briggs made a decision that was unusual but not unheard of. He decided to bring his wife, Sarah, and their 2-year-old daughter, Sophia Matilda. Their 7-year-old son, Arthur, was left behind in Massachusetts to continue his schooling. Sarah had sailed with her husband before and was comfortable at sea. She kept a diary, played the melodeon, and helped maintain a sense of normalcy aboard the ship. The crew Briggs assembled was small but experienced. There were 7 men in total. Albert Richardson served as first mate. He was 28, capable, and had sailed with Briggs on previous voyages. Andrew Gilling was the second mate, a New Yorker in his mid-20s. The cook and steward was Edward William Head, a 23-year-old from Brooklyn. The 4 sailors were all German immigrants, brothers Volkert and Bos Lorenzen, along with Arian Martins and Gottlieb Goodschall. They spoke limited English but were known to be hardworking and dependable. The cargo manifest was straightforward: 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol, denatured and intended for fortifying wine in Italy. It wasn't drinking alcohol. It had been treated with chemicals to make it poisonous if consumed. The destination was Genoa. The route was well traveled. Nothing about the voyage seemed unusual. On November 7th, 1872, the Mary Celeste was loaded, inspected, and ready to sail. Captain Briggs wrote a letter to his mother before departing. In it, he mentioned that the ship was in fine condition, the crew seemed promising, and he expected fair weather. He was optimistic. There was no hint of concern in his words. That morning, the Mary Celeste slipped out of New York Harbor and into the open Atlantic. For the first few weeks, everything appeared to go as planned. The last entry in the ship's log, dated November 25th, recorded the vessel's position near the island of Santa Maria in the Azores. The weather was noted as fair with moderate winds. The ship was making good progress, and then silence. What happened in the days that followed remains one of the most perplexing questions in maritime history. But the discovery that came next would ensure the Mary Celeste's place in legend. On November 15, 1872, 8 days after the Mary Celeste left New York, another ship departed from the same harbor. The Dei Gratia was a Canadian brigantine under the command of Captain David Morehouse, a Nova Scotian who had known Benjamin Briggs for years. They weren't close friends, but they were acquaintances, fellow mariners who respected each other. In fact, just before both ships departed, Briggs and Morehouse had dined together in New York. They discussed their upcoming voyages, their families, and the unpredictable nature of the Atlantic in winter. The Dei Gratia was also bound for Europe, carrying a cargo of petroleum. Her route roughly paralleled that of the Mary Celeste, though she departed later and sailed more slowly. For nearly 3 weeks, the two ships crossed the ocean separately, unaware of each other's positions. On the afternoon of December 4th, 1872, the Dei Gratia was approximately 400 miles east of the Azores, making steady progress toward Gibraltar. The weather was clear, the wind moderate. At around 1 o'clock, a crew member named John Johnson was on lookout duty when he spotted a sail on the horizon, several miles to the south. At first, there was nothing unusual about it. Ships crossing the Atlantic frequently passed within sight of each other, but as Johnson watched, he noticed something odd. The distant vessel was moving erratically, yawing back and forth as though no one was steering. Some of her sails were set, but others were torn or missing. She seemed to be drifting rather than sailing with purpose. Johnson alerted the officer on duty, who immediately informed Captain Morehouse. Morehouse raised his spyglass and studied the ship carefully. After a few moments, he recognized her. It was the Mary Celeste. He knew the ship, he knew Captain Briggs, and he knew something was terribly wrong. Morehouse ordered the Dei Gratia to change course and approach. As they drew closer, he called out to the Mary Celeste through a speaking trumpet. There was no response. No figures appeared on deck. No signal flags were raised. The ship continued to drift, silent and seemingly lifeless. Concerned, Morehouse made the decision to send a boarding party. His first mate, Oliver DeVoe, along with second mate John Wright and Seaman Johnson, climbed into a small boat and rowed across the gap between the two ships. The sea was calm, but the mood was tense. Boarding an abandoned vessel was always risky. Pirates, disease, structural damage, any number of dangers could be waiting. DeVoe was the first to climb aboard. He called out. No answer. He moved cautiously across the deck, checking the wheel, the rigging, the hatches. The ship was deserted. Not a single person remained. But that wasn't the strangest part. The Mary Celeste showed no signs of disaster. The deck was wet, but that was expected after weeks at sea. The wheel was unlashed, spinning freely. The binnacle, which housed the ship's compass, had been knocked out of place, and the compass itself was damaged. 2 of the hatch covers were open, exposing the cargo hold below, but there was no visible damage to the hull, no signs of fire, no evidence of an attack. Devoe descended into the cargo hold. 1,700 barrels of alcohol sat in neat rows, just as they had been loaded in New York. 9 of the barrels were later found to be empty or leaking, but the rest were intact. There was no evidence of an explosion, no scorch marks, no overwhelming fumes. The cargo was still valuable and largely undisturbed. He moved to the crew's quarters. Bunks were unmade, clothing hung from hooks. A pair of boots sat on the floor. In the galley there were pots and dishes, some unwashed. Food supplies were still in the stores. Salted meat, flour, preserved vegetables. There was enough food and fresh water to last the crew another 6 months. In the captain's cabin, the scene was even more unsettling. Personal belongings were scattered but not in disarray. A small sewing machine sat on a table. Toys that likely belonged to Sophia Matilda lay nearby. The captain's logbook was open on his desk. The last entry, dated November 25th, was routine. Position, weather, course. Nothing unusual, no mention of trouble. The ship's navigational instruments were mostly in place, but the sextant was missing. The ship's register and several other important documents were also gone. The chronometer, a crucial tool for determining longitude, had stopped. Devoe climbed back on deck and checked the rigging. The ship's jib and fore-topmast staysail were missing. The foresail and upper foretopsail were set, but torn. The main staysail was still in place, but had been hauled down and left lying on the deck. The rigging showed signs of wear, but nothing catastrophic. It was as if the crew had begun to adjust the sails and then stopped. The most telling detail was near the stern. A section of the ship's railing had been removed, and a frayed rope trailed off into the water. The ship's lifeboat was gone. Devoe examined the rope closely. It appeared to have been cut or torn, possibly under strain. He returned to the Dei Gratia and reported his findings to Captain Morehouse. The 2 men discussed what to do. Salvaging an abandoned ship at sea was legal, but it could also lead to suspicion. If the authorities believed foul play was involved, Morehouse and his crew could be accused of murder or piracy. But leaving the Mary Celeste to drift seemed wasteful and potentially dangerous to other vessels. After careful consideration, Morehouse made his decision. He would claim the ship as salvage. He ordered Devoe to take 2 crew members, return to the Mary Celeste, and sail her to the nearest port, which was Gibraltar. It was a risky move. The Dei Gratia's crew was already small, and splitting them between 2 ships left both vessels vulnerable. But Morehouse believed it was the right thing to do. For the next 12 days, the 2 ships sailed in tandem across the Atlantic. The weather was rough at times, but both vessels held steady. On December 13th, they arrived in Gibraltar. Morehouse expected a routine salvage claim. What he got instead was an interrogation. The British authorities were immediately suspicious. An abandoned ship, a convenient discovery, a generous salvage reward, it all seemed too neat. The Vice Admiralty Court opened an official investigation, and for the next 3 months the crew of the Dei Gratia would be under intense scrutiny. But what happens next is even stranger, because the investigation would raise more questions than it answered. The port of Gibraltar in December 1872 was a busy hub of maritime commerce. Ships from across Europe, Africa, and the Americas passed through its waters daily. The British authorities who governed the port were accustomed to dealing with salvage claims, shipwrecks, and disputes between captains. But the case of the Mary Celeste was different. From the moment the ship arrived, officials sensed something wasn't right. The Vice Admiralty Court assigned the case to Frederick Solly Flood, the Attorney General and Advocate General of Gibraltar. Flood was a man known for his sharp mind and his deep suspicion of sailors. He had spent years prosecuting smugglers, pirates, and fraudulent salvage claims. When he heard the details of the Mary Celeste, a ship found abandoned, no bodies, no clear explanation, his instincts told him this was a crime scene. Flood ordered the Mary Celeste impounded. He brought in surveyors, inspectors, and maritime experts to examine every inch of the vessel. He interrogated Captain Morehouse and the crew of the Dei Gratia repeatedly, searching for inconsistencies in their stories. He was convinced that someone had murdered the crew of the Mary Celeste, and he was determined to prove it. The crew of the Dei Gratia maintained their innocence. They told the same story again and again. They had found the ship drifting. They had boarded it. It was abandoned. They had brought it to Gibraltar. Oliver Deveau, the first mate, testified in detail about what he had seen. The open hatches, the missing lifeboat, the frayed rope, the undisturbed cargo. His account never wavered, but Flood wasn't satisfied. He focused on small details that seemed suspicious to him. Why was the ship's compass damaged? Why were some of the sails torn while others were neatly furled? Why was the cargo hold partially open? He began to construct a theory. Perhaps, he suggested, the crew of the Dei Gratia had encountered the Mary Celeste at sea, boarded her, murdered everyone on board, and then invented the story of finding her abandoned to claim the salvage money. To support his theory, Flood needed evidence of violence. He ordered a thorough search of the ship. Inspectors examined the deck, the cabins, the cargo hold. They were looking for bloodstains, bullet holes, anything that might indicate a struggle. And they found something. On the blade of a sword belonging to Captain Briggs there appeared to be a reddish-brown stain. Near the ship's railing, similar stains were discovered on the wood. Flood was triumphant. This, he believed, was blood, proof of murder. But when the stains were tested, the results were inconclusive. The chemical analysis available in 1872 was primitive. The substance could have been blood. It could also have been rust, residue from the denatured alcohol cargo, or simply discoloration from seawater and age. The sword, for example, had been stored in the captain's cabin for weeks, exposed to damp air. Rust was the most likely explanation. Flood also pointed to a series of cuts on the ship's bow railing. He claimed they had been made deliberately, possibly with an axe, as part of an attack. Maritime experts examined the cuts and disagreed. They noted that the Mary Celeste had a long history of accidents and repairs. The cuts could have been from any number of incidents over the years: collisions, storms, normal wear and tear. There was no evidence they were recent. Despite Flood's suspicions, no other evidence of violence was found. No bullet holes, no bloodstains in the cabins, no signs of a struggle, no bodies. The more investigators searched, the less the murder theory made sense. If the crew of the Dei Gratia had killed everyone on board, where were the bodies? Why was the cargo untouched? Why would they bring the ship to Gibraltar, where they would be immediately questioned? Captain Morehouse grew frustrated. He had done what he believed was the right thing, saving an abandoned vessel from being lost at sea. Now he was being treated like a criminal. He pointed out that he and Captain Briggs had been friends. They had dined together just before sailing. Why would he murder a man he respected? The court also questioned whether there had been a mutiny. Perhaps the crew of the Mary Celeste had turned on Captain Briggs, killed him and his family, and then fled in the lifeboat. But this theory had problems too. Briggs was known to be a fair and competent captain. None of the crew had a history of violence or insubordination. And if there had been a mutiny, why would the mutineers abandon a perfectly good ship stocked with food and water? Why not sail it to a port and sell the cargo? As the weeks dragged on, the investigation stalled. Flood couldn't find enough evidence to charge anyone with a crime. The crew of the Dei Gratia passed every test. Their story held up under scrutiny. The physical evidence on the Mary Celeste pointed to abandonment, not murder. On March 10, 1873, after 3 months of investigation, the Vice Admiralty Court issued its ruling. The crew of the Dei Gratia was cleared of all suspicion. They were awarded salvage rights to the Mary Celeste, though the amount was far less than they had hoped, only a fraction of the ship's value. The implication was clear. The court still had doubts, but it couldn't prove anything. The Mary Celeste was released back to her owners. They repaired the damage to the rigging, restocked the ship, and put her back into service. But her reputation was destroyed. Sailors began to whisper that the ship was cursed. captains struggled to find crews willing to work aboard her. Insurance companies grew wary. The mystery had turned the Mary Celeste into a ghost ship, even while she still sailed. And still, no one could explain what had happened to the 10 people who had vanished. To this day, no clear explanation exists, but the theories that emerged in the years that followed would only deepen the mystery. In the years following the discovery, investigators, writers, and amateur detectives proposed dozens of explanations for the disappearance of the Mary Celeste's crew. Some were grounded in maritime science and logic. Others ventured into the realm of wild speculation. Yet even the most plausible theories had gaps that left room for doubt. One of the earliest and most widely accepted theories centers on the ship's cargo. The Mary Celeste was carrying 1,700 barrels of denatured alcohol, a highly flammable and volatile substance. 9 of those barrels were later found to be empty or damaged. The prevailing theory is that fumes from the leaking alcohol accumulated in the cargo hold, creating a dangerous situation. If Captain Briggs went below deck to inspect the cargo and noticed the fumes, he may have feared an imminent explosion. Denatured alcohol, when mixed with air in the right proportions, can ignite violently. Even the smallest spark from a lantern, a tool, or static electricity could trigger a blast. For an experienced captain like Briggs, the risk would have been obvious. In a moment of panic, he may have ordered everyone into the lifeboat. The plan could have been simple. Distance the crew from the ship until the danger passed, then return once it was safe. To keep the lifeboat tethered to the Mary Celeste, they may have tied it with a rope, intending to pull themselves back once the fumes dispersed. But what if something went wrong? What if the rope snapped under strain? What if a sudden wave or gust of wind pulled the lifeboat away from the ship? In the open Atlantic, with no oars or sails strong enough to fight the current, a small lifeboat could be swept away in minutes. The crew would have watched helplessly as the Mary Celeste drifted out of reach, its sails still set, moving steadily away. Left adrift, the crew would have had little chance of survival. A lifeboat designed for emergencies, not long voyages, would offer no protection from the elements. Dehydration, hypothermia, and exposure would set in within days. Even if they tried to row toward the nearest land, the Azores were hundreds of miles away. Eventually, the sea would claim them. Meanwhile, the Mary Celeste, with no explosion occurring, would have continued sailing on autopilot. The wind in her sails would have pushed her forward, the wheel unlashed and spinning freely. When the Dei Gratia found her 9 days later, she had drifted roughly 400 miles from her last logged position. It was entirely possible. This theory explains several key details: the missing lifeboat, the frayed rope trailing from the stern, the absence of violence or struggle, the open cargo hatches which Briggs may have opened to ventilate the hold. Even the missing sextant makes sense. Briggs would have taken it with him to navigate if they became separated from the ship. But it's still speculation. There's no direct evidence that fumes were present, no scorch marks, no reports from the Dei Gratia's crew of smelling alcohol when they boarded, and most importantly, no wreckage of the lifeboat was ever found. If the crew perished at sea, their bodies and the boat itself should have washed ashore somewhere eventually. But nothing was ever recovered. Another theory involves a sudden seismic event. The Azores sit atop a geologically active zone where tectonic plates meet beneath the Atlantic. Underwater earthquakes and volcanic activity are not uncommon in the region. Some researchers believe a seaquake could have occurred near the Mary Celeste, causing the ship to lurch violently. If the crew felt the ship shudder and heard rumbling from below, they may have believed the vessel was breaking apart. Seaquakes can create the sensation of a ship striking rocks or reefs, even in open water. In a state of panic, Briggs may have ordered an immediate evacuation, believing the ship was about to sink. Only after abandoning the Mary Celeste would they have realized their mistake, that the ship was still intact and seaworthy. This theory accounts for the hasty departure and the missing lifeboat. It also explains why there were no signs of structural damage. The seaquake would have caused vibrations and noise, but not necessarily harm to the ship itself. However, like the alcohol fumes theory, it's impossible to prove. No seismic records from 1872 exist for that region. And again, no lifeboat wreckage was ever found. A less dramatic but intriguing theory involves contaminated food or water. Ergot poisoning caused by a fungus that grows on rye and other grains can induce severe hallucinations, paranoia, and irrational behavior. If the ship's bread or flour had been contaminated, the entire crew could have experienced mass psychosis. Under the influence of ergot, they may have hallucinated threats that weren't there. Imagine pirates, sea monsters, or divine visions. In a delusional state, they could have abandoned the ship, believing it was cursed or doomed. But this theory has significant weaknesses. Ergot poisoning typically affects individuals at different rates, and it seems unlikely that all 10 people would have been incapacitated simultaneously. And once again, there's no physical evidence to support it. Piracy was mentioned in some early accounts, but it makes little sense. Pirates would have taken the cargo, the ship's stores, and anything else of value. They certainly wouldn't have left 1,700 barrels of commercial alcohol behind. And there were no signs of violence, no bloodstains, no damage consistent with an attack. Mutiny was also considered, but it's equally implausible. Captain Briggs was known to be fair and competent. The crew had no history of trouble, and even if a mutiny had occurred, why would the mutineers flee in a lifeboat instead of taking the ship itself? Some have proposed more exotic explanations. A rogue wave, a giant squid, a paranormal event. These ideas, while dramatic, lack any supporting evidence. The condition of the ship simply doesn't match the chaos such events would create. What remains most haunting is that every theory has flaws. Every explanation leaves unanswered questions. The truth, if it exists, has been lost to the sea. But the story doesn't end with theories, because the fate of the Mary Celeste herself is almost as strange as the mystery that made her famous. After the investigation in Gibraltar concluded, the Mary Celeste was returned to her owners, repaired, and put back into service. But the ship's reputation never recovered. Word of the mystery had spread quickly, first through shipping circles, then to newspapers and the public. Sailors began to view the Mary Celeste as cursed. Superstition ran deep among seafarers, and a ship with such a dark history was seen as unlucky, even dangerous. Finding crews willing to work aboard her became increasingly difficult. Captains who agreed to command the vessel often struggled to keep sailors from deserting at the first port. Stories circulated, whispers of strange noises at night, visions of phantom figures on deck, unexplained accidents. Whether these stories were true or simply the product of fear and imagination, they had the same effect. The Mary Celeste became a pariah. The ship changed hands repeatedly over the next decade. Each new owner hoped to turn a profit, but the stigma was too strong. Insurance companies grew wary, raising premiums or refusing coverage altogether. Voyages that should have been routine became financial losses. The Mary Celeste, once a functional and profitable vessel, was now a burden. By the early 1880s, the ship was aging. Her hull showed signs of wear. Her rigging needed constant repair. She was no longer worth the cost of maintaining her. But one man saw an opportunity. In 1884, a Boston shipping agent named Gilman Parker purchased the Mary Celeste for a fraction of her original value. Parker was not a sailor, he was a businessman, and not a particularly honest one. He had a plan, and it had nothing to do with sailing. Parker loaded the ship with a cargo that was, on paper, extremely valuable. Barrels of fish, boots, and other goods were listed on the manifest with inflated values. In reality, much of the cargo was worthless, damaged goods, items of little market value. Parker insured the cargo for far more than it was worth. Then he hired a captain named Gilman Parker, no relation, to sail the ship to Haiti. The plan was simple. The ship would be deliberately wrecked, the cargo declared lost, and Parker would collect the insurance money. It was fraud, plain and simple, But Parker believed he could get away with it. On January 3, 1885, the Mary Celeste set sail from Boston, bound for Port-au-Prince, Haiti. 12 days later, on January 15th, the ship ran aground on a coral reef near Rochelet Bank, off the coast of Haiti. The captain claimed it was an accident, poor visibility, unexpected currents, a tragic mistake. But investigators weren't convinced. The wreck was too convenient. The reef was well charted and the weather had been clear. Experienced sailors in the area testified that the ship had been deliberately steered onto the rocks. When inspectors examined the cargo, they found it was largely worthless, nothing close to the value claimed on the insurance documents. Parker was charged with barratry, the deliberate destruction of a ship for financial gain. It was a serious crime, punishable by imprisonment. The trial began in Boston in early 1885. Evidence was presented, witnesses testified. The fraud was obvious, but the case never reached a verdict. The jury, for reasons that remain unclear, could not agree. Some believed Parker was guilty, others had doubts. A mistrial was declared. Parker avoided prison, but his reputation was destroyed. He was financially ruined. Within months, he fell ill. He died a short time later, some say, from the stress and disgrace of the trial. The Mary Celeste was left to rot on the reef. Battered by waves, picked over by salvagers, the ship slowly disintegrated. The once proud brigantine, already infamous, was consumed by the sea. By the end of the 1880s, nothing remained but scattered timbers and fading memories. But the mystery didn't fade with the wreckage. If anything, it grew stronger. In 1884, just a year before the ship's final voyage, a young writer named Arthur Conan Doyle published a short story titled J. Habakkuk Jeffson's Statement. The story was a fictionalized account of the Mary Celeste mystery, featuring murder, conspiracy, and intrigue. Doyle took liberties with the facts. He changed the ship's name to the Marie Celeste, added sensational details, and invented a dramatic backstory. The story was published in a popular magazine and quickly gained attention. Many readers believed it was true. They didn't realize it was fiction. Doyle's version of events became so widely accepted that even today, some of the detail, with the warm breakfast on the table, the captain's log ending mid-sentence, are repeated as fact even though they never happened. This blending of fact and fiction only deepened the legend. The Mary Celeste became more than a mystery. It became a symbol of the unknown, the unexplained, the eerie power of the sea. Over the decades that followed, the story was retold countless times. Books, articles, documentaries, and films explored the case. Researchers pored over the original records, searching for clues. New theories emerged, old theories were revisited, but no one ever found the definitive answer. Even today, more than 150 years later, the Mary Celeste remains one of the most famous, unsolved mysteries in maritime history. The ship is referenced in discussions of the Bermuda Triangle, ghost ships, and unexplained disappearances. It's become a touchstone for anyone fascinated by the strange and the unknown. What makes the Mary Celeste so enduring is not just the mystery itself, but what it represents. It's a reminder that even in the modern age, with all our science and technology, some events remain beyond explanation. The ocean is vast, unpredictable, and unforgiving. It holds its secrets close, and sometimes those secrets are never revealed. The people aboard the Mary Celeste, Captain Benjamin Briggs, his wife Sarah, their daughter Sophia Matilda, and the 7 crew members left no final words, no distress signal, no note. They simply disappeared into the unknown, leaving behind only questions. We can imagine their final moments. Perhaps they stood in the lifeboat, watching the Mary Celeste drift away, its sails full, moving steadily across the horizon. Perhaps they called out, hoping to be rescued by a passing ship. Perhaps in the end, they simply closed their eyes and accepted the inevitable. Or perhaps something else happened. Something we can't imagine. Something the sea will never reveal. Some mysteries are never meant to be solved. Perhaps that's what makes them so powerful. They remind us that the world is still full of wonder, uncertainty, and things we may never fully understand. The Mary Celeste remains one of the sea's greatest puzzles, a ship found sailing with no one aboard, a crew vanished without explanation, and a story that refuses to be forgotten. What really happened on that cold November day in 1872? We may never know, but the mystery endures. Waiting in the waves just beyond the horizon, a ghost ship sailing through history, forever searching for an answer that may never come. Thanks for watching.